Marshall's men circle the isolated ranch, torches blazing in the pre-dawn darkness. Inside the barn, the giant cowboy shields his trembling ranch hand, rifle raised. 6 guns against 2 men who refuse to be separated. Blood will spill before sunrise decides who walks away. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you're watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. The young ranch hand trembled in the corner of the barn, his back pressed against the rough wood as he watched the massive silhouette fill the doorway. Dalton Rivers stood well over 6.5 feet tall, his shoulders so broad they nearly touched both sides of the frame. His presence alone seemed to swallow all the air from the space, leaving nothing but the scent of leather and sweat and something darker. Something that made the boys' pulse race with equal parts terror and forbidden anticipation. "I told you what would happen if you tried to run again." Dalton's voice rumbled through the dim space, deep and commanding as distant thunder. The boy, Thomas, could only whimper in response, his wide green eyes tracking every movement as the giant cowboy stepped inside and closed the door behind him with deliberate finality. Thomas was 19, slender and untouched, hired just 3 weeks ago to help with the horses at Dalton's isolated ranch. He had been innocent in every sense when he arrived, naive to the ways of men like Dalton Rivers, men who looked at him with hunger, barely leashed behind cold blue eyes. He should have been afraid. He was afraid. But beneath the fear lived something else entirely. Something that made his breath come short and his body respond in ways he did not fully understand. "Please," Thomas whispered, though he could not have said what he was begging for. Mercy or something else entirely, something he had never experienced but craved with an intensity that terrified him. Dalton moved closer with predatory grace despite his massive size. Each step made the floorboards creak in protest, made Thomas's heart slam harder against his ribs. When the giant finally stood before him, towering over his much smaller frame, Thomas had to crane his neck back to meet those piercing eyes. "You have been testing me, boy," Dalton said quietly, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "Running off when there is work to be done, hiding in the barn when I call for you, looking at me with those wide, innocent eyes like you do not know exactly what you are doing." "I do not," Thomas protested weakly, his voice breaking. "I don't know what you mean." Dalton's hand shot out, gripping Thomas's chin with fingers that could crush bone but held with controlled force. He forced the boy's head up, making him maintain eye contact even as tears began to spill down Thomas's flushed cheeks. "You know exactly what you're doing," Dalton growled. "You know what those tears do to me, how they make me want to show you exactly what happens when you push a man beyond his limits." Thomas's breath hitched, more tears streaming down his face as fear and something shamefully close to excitement warred within him. "I am sorry," he gasped. "I will not run again. I swear it." "Oh, you will not run again," Dalton agreed, his thumb brushing away a tear with surprising gentleness that made Thomas shudder. "But not because you promise, because by the time I am done with you tonight, you will not want to run. You will beg to stay." The words sent electricity racing down Thomas's spine. His whole body trembled as Dalton's other hand came up to grip his shoulder, the size and strength of that grip making Thomas feel small and fragile and utterly at this man's mercy. "Do you understand what I am telling you, boy?" Dalton demanded, his voice rough with restrained desire. "If you stay in this barn with me tonight, there is no going back. I will make you mine in every way that matters. I will push you past every limit you think you have. And those pretty tears of yours, they will only make me more determined to show you pleasures you have never imagined." Thomas should have said no, should have pushed past the giant and fled into the night. But his body would not obey the panicked commands of his mind. Instead, he heard himself whisper, "Show me." Dalton's eyes blazed with triumph and hunger. He released Thomas's chin, only to grip the boy's wrist, his massive hand easily encircling the slender bones. "Come," he commanded, dragging Thomas deeper into the barn, where a pile of clean hay had been prepared with blankets spread over it, clearly arranged with intention. The sight of that makeshift bed made Thomas's knees weak. Dalton had planned this, had known Thomas would come to the barn tonight, had prepared for the moment when the boy's resistance finally crumbled. The realization that he had been so transparent, so easily read, brought fresh tears to Thomas's eyes. "Already crying, and we have barely begun," Dalton observed, with dark satisfaction. "Good. Your tears make it better. They make me want to be rougher, to push you harder, to hear you whimper and beg, while I take everything you have never given anyone before." Thomas trembled violently as Dalton guided him to the blankets and pushed him down with a hand to his chest. The giant cowboy followed him down, his massive body covering Thomas's smaller frame completely. The weight of him, the heat and solid muscle pressing down, made Thomas gasp and squirm instinctively. "Stay still," Dalton ordered, his voice brooking no argument. "You wanted this. You have been wanting this since the day you arrived, looking at me with hunger you did not understand. Now you are going to get it, every overwhelming inch of it. And you are going to take it like a good boy." "I cannot," Thomas whimpered, even as his body arched up against Dalton's, seeking more contact despite his protests. "I have never experienced anything like this before." "I know," Dalton rumbled, his hands beginning to work at Thomas's shirt with methodical efficiency. "That is what makes this so perfect. You are completely untouched, completely mine to shape and claim and teach. By morning, you will know exactly who you belong to." Thomas's shirt came away, leaving him bare from the waist up beneath Dalton's hungry gaze. The giant's hands, rough with calluses from years of ranch work, traced over the smooth skin with possessive thoroughness. Each touch made Thomas gasp and shiver, sensations he had never felt before, flooding his nervous system with overwhelming intensity. "So responsive," Dalton murmured, his thumbs brushing over sensitive skin and making Thomas cry out. "So desperate for it, even though you are scared. Do you feel how your body betrays you, boy? How it begs for what your mind fears?" "Please," Thomas sobbed, tears streaming freely now. "It is too much. I cannot handle this." "You can, and you will," Dalton commanded, his weight shifting as he positioned himself more firmly over Thomas's trembling form. "Those tears tell me you need this as badly as I do. They tell me you are ready to surrender everything to me." What followed was a slow, deliberate claiming that had Thomas sobbing and whimpering into the hay-scented darkness. Dalton took his time, drawing out every moment, pushing past Thomas's initial resistance with relentless determination. The giant's hands seemed to be everywhere at once, touching and gripping and claiming, mapping every inch of Thomas's body with possessive thoroughness. "That is it," Dalton growled as Thomas writhed beneath him, overwhelmed by sensations his innocent body had never experienced. "Let those tears fall. Let me hear you cry. It makes me want you even more." Thomas could not stop the tears even if he wanted to. They poured from his eyes as waves of overwhelming feeling crashed over him, pleasure and pain blending together until he could not tell where one ended and the other began. Dalton's massive body moved against his with devastating purpose, each motion calculated to drive Thomas higher into mindless sensation. "You are mine now," Dalton whispered harshly against Thomas's ear as the boy sobbed and trembled beneath him. "Say it. Tell me who you belong to. You." Thomas gasped between hitching breaths. "I belong to you." "Louder," Dalton demanded, his movements becoming more aggressive, more demanding. "I want to hear you scream it." "I belong to you," Thomas cried out, his voice breaking with emotion and overwhelming intensity. "Only you, Dalton, please." The giant made a sound of deep satisfaction, his control fracturing as Thomas's desperate cries pushed him beyond restraint. He drove into the boy's willing submission with powerful force, each motion drawing fresh whimpers and tears from Thomas's trembling form. When the peak finally crashed over them both, Thomas screamed Dalton's name into the darkness, his voice raw and broken and utterly conquered. Dalton followed with a roar that shook the barn walls, claiming his victory with primal satisfaction as Thomas shattered completely beneath him. In the aftermath, Thomas lay boneless and trembling, tears still streaming down his flushed cheeks. Dalton gathered the smaller man against his broad chest, his earlier aggression gentling into something almost tender as he pressed kisses to Thomas's tear-stained face. Perfect, Dalton murmured, his massive hands stroking soothingly over Thomas's quaking body. You took everything I gave you. Such a good boy for me. Thomas could only whimper in response, overwhelmed and wrung out and fundamentally changed by what they had just shared. Dalton's arms tightened around him protectively, the giant's size and strength now offering comfort rather than threat. Your tears made it better, Dalton whispered, echoing his earlier promise. Made me want to give you more, push you harder, show you exactly how good it can be when you surrender completely. Did you like it, boy? Did you like crying for me while I took what I wanted? Thomas buried his burning face against Dalton's chest, shame and satisfaction warring within him. Yes, he admitted in a tiny voice. I have never felt anything like that before. And you never will with anyone else, Dalton said with absolute certainty, his tone brooking no argument. You're mine now, Thomas. Your tears, your submission, your pleasure, all of it belongs to me. The possessive declaration should have frightened Thomas. Instead, it made warmth bloom in his chest, made him press closer to the massive body holding him so carefully. Yes, he whispered, I am yours. They lay together as the night deepened. Dalton's hands never stopping their soothing caresses over Thomas's sensitized skin. Eventually, the boy's tears dried and his breathing steadied, exhaustion pulling him towards sleep, despite everything his body had just endured. Sleep, Dalton commanded softly. Tomorrow we begin your real education. Tonight was just to break you in, to show you what happens when you test my patience. Tomorrow I start teaching you how to please me properly. Thomas shivered at the promise, equal parts anxious and eager to discover what other overwhelming experiences awaited him. As consciousness faded, held safe in Dalton's powerful arms, he realized that he had been running not from the giant cowboy, but toward this moment, toward the surrender he had craved without understanding. The morning sun painted the barn in shades of gold when Thomas woke to find Dalton already awake, watching him with intense blue eyes. The giant's expression was contemplative, possessive, utterly satisfied in a way that made Thomas's cheeks burn with memory of the night before. Good morning, boy, Dalton rumbled, one massive hand coming up to cup Thomas's face. How do you feel? Thomas took inventory of his body, feeling the aches and reminders of Dalton's thorough claiming. Sore, he admitted quietly, and overwhelmed. Good, Dalton said with dark satisfaction. You should feel thoroughly used. That is how I want you every morning from now on, marked and aching with proof of my ownership. The casual dominance in those words sent heat rushing through Thomas despite his exhaustion. He bit his lip, unsure how to respond to such blatant possession. Dalton's thumb traced his lower lip, pulling it free from his teeth. None of that, the giant commanded. If you want to bite something, you bite me. Understand? Thomas nodded mutely, his breath catching as Dalton shifted position to loom over him once more. The sight of all that muscle and masculine power focused entirely on him made Thomas feel small and vulnerable and desperately aroused despite having been thoroughly claimed mere hours ago. I think you need a reminder of who you belong to, Dalton observed, noting Thomas's body's helpless response. Your sweet little sounds last night were not enough. I want to hear you cry for me again in the daylight. Please, Thomas whimpered, though whether he was begging for mercy or more he genuinely could not say. I am already so sore. That is not a refusal, Dalton noted with satisfaction. You beg so prettily, boy, but your body tells me you want this as much as I do. Those tears gathering in your eyes, they are not from fear or pain. They are from need you do not know how to express. The accusation was devastatingly accurate. Thomas felt tears spill over as his body trembled with conflicting desires, wanting desperately to submit again, even as his mind screamed that he needed rest and recovery. Dalton watched those tears with hungry appreciation, then leaned down to lick them from Thomas's cheeks. There it is, the giant growled. That is what I wanted to see. Your beautiful tears making everything better. What followed was slower than the night before, but no less overwhelming. Dalton took his time in the golden morning light, making Thomas sob and beg and plead as pleasure built to unbearable intensity. The giant seemed determined to wring every possible sound from Thomas's throat, to map every sensitive spot that made the boy cry out. "Look at me," Dalton commanded when Thomas tried to hide his face in shame at how wantonly he was responding. "I want to see those pretty eyes when you come apart for me again." Thomas forced his gaze up, meeting Dalton's intense stare even as tears streamed down his face. The giant smiled with dark approval, his movements becoming more demanding, more aggressive, driving Thomas toward the edge with ruthless precision. "That is my good boy," Dalton praised as Thomas began to fracture beneath the onslaught. "Cry for me. Show me how overwhelming this is. Let those tears tell me everything you are too proud to say." When Thomas finally shattered with a sobbing cry, Dalton watched with fierce satisfaction, his own control breaking as the boy's submission pushed him over the edge. They collapsed together in a tangle of sweat-slicked limbs, Thomas trembling and crying while Dalton held him with possessive gentleness. "Perfect," the giant murmured into Thomas's hair. "Absolutely perfect. You have no idea how long I have wanted to see you like this, completely undone in mine." Thomas could only whimper in response, too wrung out for words. Dalton's hands stroked soothing patterns over his back, easing him down from the overwhelming high. Eventually, when the tears stopped and Thomas's breathing steadied, Dalton shifted them both to sitting position. "Time to face reality, boy," the giant said firmly, but not unkindly. "We need to talk about what this means going forward." Thomas felt anxiety spike in his chest. "What do you mean?" Dalton's hand came up to grip the back of Thomas's neck, not painfully, but with clear possession. "I mean you are mine now. Not just for a night or two. Mine permanently. You live in my house, sleep in my bed, submit to my demands whenever I want you. In return, I protect you, provide for you, give you more pleasure than you ever imagined possible." The proposition should have offended Thomas. Instead, it sent relief flooding through him so intense it brought fresh tears to his eyes. "You want to keep me?" he asked in a small voice. Dalton's expression softened fractionally. "Want implies there is a choice. I am keeping you, Thomas. The only question is whether you fight me every step of the way or accept what we both know you desperately need." Thomas searched the giant's face, seeing certainty and possessiveness, and something that might have been tenderness buried beneath the dominant exterior. "I accept," he whispered. "I want to be yours." Dalton's smile was victorious and warm at once. "Good boy. Now let me get you cleaned up and fed. I worked you hard last night and this morning. You need to rebuild your strength because tonight I am going to push you even further." The promise sent shivers racing through Thomas even as Dalton lifted him effortlessly and carried him toward the house. The casual display of strength made Thomas feel cherished and claimed all at once, reminding him exactly how thoroughly he belonged to this massive man now. As they crossed the threshold into Dalton's bedroom, Thomas saw that the space had been prepared with the same deliberate intention as the barn had been. Fresh linens on the huge bed, water for washing, food laid out on the bedside table. Dalton had been planning this seduction for far longer than one night. "You knew I would give in," Thomas accused softly. Dalton set him down gently on the edge of the bed and knelt before him, bringing them to eye level, despite the giant's size. "I knew you wanted this as much as I did," he corrected. "I just had to wait for you to stop being afraid of what you desired. And now you are mine," Dalton said simply, his hands resting possessively on Thomas's thighs. "Now I teach you exactly what that means." The education Dalton promised began immediately and continued throughout the day. He showed Thomas how to please him with hands and mouth, demonstrated positions that drew the most overwhelming responses from the smaller man's inexperienced body, pushed Thomas past embarrassment into honest expression of need and desire. By evening, Thomas was wrung out and trembling, his voice hoarse from crying out, his body marked with evidence of Dalton's thorough ownership. The giant bathed him with careful hands, then fed him from his own fingers, the acts of care interspersed with casually possessive touches that kept Thomas in a constant state of arousal. "You did well today," Dalton praised as he settled them both into bed. Thomas curled against his massive chest. Very well for your first full day of training. Training, Thomas repeated weakly. Is that what this is? Dalton's laugh rumbled through his chest. Oh boy, we have barely begun. Give me a month and you will be perfectly trained to meet my every need. But for tonight, you rest. Tomorrow we continue. Thomas should have been exhausted beyond arousal, but Dalton's words, the promise of continued ownership and use, sent heat pooling low in his belly. The giant noticed his body's response and chuckled darkly. Insatiable already, he observed with satisfaction. But no, tonight you sleep. I want you recovered enough to cry properly when I take you again tomorrow. The casual assumption that there would be tears, that Dalton wanted and expected Thomas's emotional responses, should not have been as arousing as it was. But Thomas felt himself responding to the dominant certainty in the giant's voice, felt his body preparing to surrender once more. Sleep, Dalton commanded, his hand stroking possessively over Thomas's hip. That's an order, boy. Thomas closed his eyes obediently, exhaustion finally claiming him despite his lingering arousal. As he drifted off, Dalton's words echoed in his mind. Your tears make it better. The giant had said it repeatedly throughout the day, each time with increasing satisfaction as Thomas cried and whimpered and begged. Somewhere in the haze between waking and sleep, Thomas realized that he liked making Dalton satisfied, liked seeing the hunger and approval in those ice-blue eyes when tears streamed down his face, liked being pushed past his limits and held together when he shattered, liked belonging to someone so completely. The realization should have terrified him. Instead, it brought peace. He had spent his whole life feeling lost and directionless, never quite fitting anywhere. Now, in Dalton's possessive grip, he had finally found where he belonged. The cost was his autonomy, his pride, his innocence. But the reward was purpose and protection and pleasure beyond anything he had imagined. Thomas slept deeply and dreamlessly, safe in Dalton's arms. When he woke in the pre-dawn darkness to the giant's hands already exploring his body, he did not protest or pull away. He simply surrendered to the overwhelming intensity once more, letting tears flow freely as Dalton claimed him again in the quiet darkness. Perfect, Dalton growled against his throat as Thomas sobbed and trembled. So perfect when you cry for me. Let it all out, boy. Give me those beautiful tears. Thomas gave him everything, holding nothing back, crying and begging and pleading as Dalton drove him to heights of sensation that left him shaking and incoherent. And when it was over, when they lay tangled together in the aftermath, Dalton whispered praise and promises that made Thomas's heart clench with emotion. Mine, the giant murmured, pressing kisses to Thomas's tear-stained face. All mine, forever, yours. Thomas agreed in a broken whisper, always yours. The sun rose on their second full day together, painting the room in soft light that turned Dalton's bronze skin golden and caught in Thomas's tear-damp lashes like diamonds. The giant studied his claimed prize with satisfaction, noting every mark and proof of ownership decorating the smaller man's body. Breakfast first, Dalton declared, finally releasing Thomas from his grip. Then I think we will work on your stamina. I want to see how long I can keep you crying and begging before you truly cannot take any more. The promise sent anticipation mixed with trepidation through Thomas. He dressed in the clothes Dalton provided, noting absently that they were finer than anything he had owned before, clearly purchased with the intention of adorning someone the giant wanted to keep. Over breakfast, Dalton laid out his expectations clearly. Thomas would handle the lighter ranch work, keeping the house and stable clean, preparing meals, tending the kitchen garden. In exchange, Dalton would provide everything Thomas needed, including the overwhelming physical attention the boy clearly craved despite his inexperience. And at night, Thomas asked quietly. At night, you are mine completely, Dalton said with dark promise. During the day too, whenever I want you. Your body belongs to me now, Thomas. I will use it however I please, as often as I please, and you will thank me for the privilege. The dominant certainty in those words should have angered Thomas. Instead, they made him feel valued and desired in a way nothing else ever had. He nodded slowly, accepting the terms of his new existence. "Good boy," Dalton praised, the approval in his voice making Thomas flush with pleasure. "Now finish eating. You will need your strength for what I have planned." What followed over the next weeks established the pattern of their life together. Dalton pushed Thomas relentlessly, teaching him to submit with grace, to express his needs honestly, to accept pleasure without shame. And Thomas learned, his initial tears of overwhelm gradually transforming into tears of release and joy. The giant never tired of seeing Thomas cry. Each tear seemed to fuel his desire, spurring him to greater heights of dominance and possession. And Thomas discovered that he never tired of surrendering, of being pushed past his limits and held together as he shattered, of belonging so completely to someone who treasured what he offered. 1 month after that first night in the barn, Thomas woke wrapped in Dalton's arms and realized he could no longer remember what life had been like before. The innocent boy who had arrived seeking simple ranch work had been transformed into someone who understood his own desires, who accepted his need for surrender, who found purpose in pleasing the giant who owned him so thoroughly. "Happy?" Dalton asked, his deep voice rumbling through the early morning quiet. Thomas considered the question honestly. He was marked and claimed, possessed and used, pushed beyond limits he had not known he had. His body ached constantly from Dalton's attentions. His throat was often hoarse from crying out. His eyes were perpetually rimmed with the evidence of tears shed in overwhelming pleasure. "Yes," he answered simply, "happier than I have ever been." Dalton's arms tightened around him possessively. "Good, because I am never letting you go, boy. You are mine for as long as we both live." The declaration was absolute, allowing no room for doubt or negotiation. Thomas smiled against Dalton's chest, letting himself sink deeper into the giant's embrace. "I don't want to go anywhere," he whispered. "This is exactly where I belong." But their isolated paradise could not last forever. The morning everything changed started like any other. With Dalton waking Thomas before dawn, with demanding hands and hungry mouth, Thomas surrendered immediately, his body responding with practiced eagerness to every touch and command. The tears came easily now, flowing freely as Dalton drove him to overwhelming heights, and the giant drank them in with the same satisfaction he always showed. When they finally emerged from the bedroom, sweaty and satisfied, the sun was already climbing toward its peak. Dalton sent Thomas to tend the horses while he rode out to check the fence line along the northern property. They parted with a deep kiss that promised more to come when evening fell. Thomas was in the barn, brushing down Dalton's massive black stallion when he heard horses approaching, multiple riders moving fast, his heart clenched with sudden fear. No one ever came to Dalton's isolated ranch without invitation. The giant preferred his privacy, preferred keeping his relationship with Thomas away from the judgment of others who would not understand. He moved to the barn door and froze. 6 riders circled the yard, their faces hard and their hands resting near their weapons. At the center rode a man Thomas recognized with sinking dread. Marshal Clayton Webb, the law from 3 territories over, known for his rigid morality and brutal enforcement of propriety. "You must be the boy," Webb said, his voice dripping with disgust as he looked Thomas up and down. Thomas Garrett, reported missing from his family's homestead 6 weeks ago. Thomas's mind reeled. Missing. He had not been missing. He had left home seeking work, seeking escape from a father who drank and a future that held nothing but hardship. No one had cared when he left, or so he had thought. "I am not missing," Thomas said, lifting his chin despite his fear. "I am exactly where I choose to be." Webb's expression hardened. "Your father filed a complaint. Said you were seduced and corrupted by Dalton Rivers, known deviant. Said Rivers uses his size and strength to force young men into unnatural relations." The accusation was so far from the truth, it would have been laughable if not for the guns pointing at Thomas and the cold certainty in Webb's eyes. "Dalton never forced me to do anything," Thomas said firmly. "I chose this. I choose him. You are 19 years old, Webb replied. Too young to understand what you are choosing, too innocent to recognize manipulation when you are caught in it. He gestured to his men. Bring the boy. We will take him back to his family where he belongs. Thomas backed away, panic rising. No, you cannot make me leave. This is my home now. But the men were already dismounting, moving toward him with grim purpose. Thomas turned to run deeper into the barn, but strong hands caught him, dragging him back despite his struggles. He fought with desperate strength born of terror, knowing that if they took him away from Dalton, he would never find his way back to the only place he had ever truly belonged. Get your hands off him. The voice was thunder, deep and deadly. Dalton stood at the barn entrance. Having returned at the sound of commotion, he was even more imposing than usual, rage making his already massive frame seem to expand, his ice-blue eyes blazing with lethal intent. The men holding Thomas hesitated, clearly intimidated despite their numbers. Webb, however, showed no fear. He nudged his horse forward, one hand resting on his pistol. Dalton Rivers, you are under arrest for corruption of a minor, kidnapping, and crimes against nature. Release the boy and come peacefully, or we will take you by force. Dalton's laugh was harsh and humorless. Thomas is 19, not a minor. He came to my ranch seeking work in state of his own free will. There is no crime here except the one you are committing by trying to separate two consenting adults. His family says otherwise, Webb countered, and the law agrees. What you have done to this boy is an abomination. What I have done, Dalton said quietly, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr, is give him a home where he is valued and protected. Something his family clearly failed to do if he felt the need to run away in the first place. Thomas found his voice, tears already streaming down his face. Please, he begged. Please do not take me away from him. I need him. I choose him. Webb's face twisted with disgust at the tears, at the obvious devotion in Thomas's voice. You see, he said to his men, the boy is broken, trained like a dog to beg for his master. This is exactly the kind of corruption we are here to stop. The words struck Thomas like physical blows. Broken, trained, as if his love and submission were evidence of damage rather than choice. As if his tears were proof of abuse, rather than overwhelming emotion. Dalton moved with shocking speed for a man his size. He crossed the distance to Thomas in 3 long strides, shoving aside the men holding the boy and pulling Thomas against his chest. His arms wrapped around the smaller frame with fierce protectiveness, and when he spoke, his voice carried absolute conviction. If you want to take him, you will have to kill me first. And I promise you, Marshal, I will take at least half your men with me before I fall. The standoff held for a long, tense moment. Webb studied Dalton's face, clearly weighing his options. The giant cowboy meant every word of his threat, and the Marshal knew it. Blood would be spilled if he pushed this further, possibly including his own. Finally, Webb raised a hand, signaling his men to stand down. This is not over, Rivers, he said coldly. I will return with more men, with proper warrants, and next time there will be no negotiation. He wheeled his horse and rode out, his men following reluctantly. Dalton did not move until the sound of hoofbeats faded completely. Only then did he relax his grip, tilting Thomas's tear-stained face up to meet his eyes. Are you all right? He asked, his voice gentle now, despite the rage still simmering beneath the surface. Thomas shook his head, fresh sobs breaking loose. They think you forced me. They think I am broken and need to be saved. They don't understand that you are the one who saved me. Dalton pressed kisses to his forehead, his cheeks, catching tears with his lips. I know, he murmured. I know, boy, but we have a problem. Webb will return, and next time he will bring the law's full weight. We cannot fight the entire territory. Then what do? Thomas asked desperately. We run, Dalton said simply. Tonight, we take what we can carry and ride west, beyond Webb's jurisdiction, beyond anyone who knows us. Start fresh, somewhere no one cares, what 2 men do behind closed doors. The plan was risky, abandoning everything Dalton had built, but Thomas saw no alternative. He nodded against the giant's chest. Anywhere, he whispered. As long as I am with you. They spent the afternoon preparing in tense silence, gathering supplies, saddling horses, burning anything that might track their passage. As sunset painted the sky blood red, they took one last look at the ranch that had been their sanctuary. "Ready?" Dalton asked, extending a hand. Thomas took it without hesitation. "With you, always." They rode into the gathering darkness, leaving behind the only home Thomas had ever chosen. But wrapped in Dalton's protective presence, fleeing toward an uncertain future, Thomas felt no fear. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. And that was enough. They rode hard through the night, pushing west into territory Dalton knew from his years before settling down. The land grew rougher, more unforgiving, perfect for men who needed to disappear. By dawn, they had crossed into the next territory, and by noon, they were deep in canyon country, where the law rarely ventured and questions were never asked. Dalton finally called a halt in a narrow canyon with a spring-fed pool. Thomas slid from his horse, every muscle screaming from the brutal ride. He had never been much of a rider before coming to Dalton's ranch, and hours in the saddle had left him aching and exhausted. "Come here," Dalton commanded softly, and Thomas obeyed without thought, moving into the giant's arms despite his weariness. Dalton held him close, one massive hand stroking through his sweat-dampened hair. "You did well," he murmured. "I know that was hard." Thomas buried his face against Dalton's chest, tears finally breaking free now that they had stopped moving. "I am sorry," he sobbed. "This is my fault. If my father had not reported me missing, if I had told someone where I was going—" "Hush," Dalton interrupted firmly, tilting Thomas's face up. "None of this is your fault. Your father had no right to interfere in your choices. Webb had no right to judge what happens between us. This is the world's failure, not yours." "But you lost everything because of me," Thomas protested, tears streaming faster. "Your home, your ranch, everything you built." "I did not lose everything," Dalton corrected, his thumbs brushing away tears with familiar tenderness. "I still have you." "That is all that matters." The simple declaration made Thomas cry harder, overwhelmed by the depth of Dalton's commitment. The giant gathered him closer, holding him through the storm of emotion until the sobs finally subsided into hiccuping breaths. "Better?" Dalton asked when Thomas had quieted. Thomas nodded against his chest. "Your tears always make things better," he quoted back, earning a rough chuckle from the giant. "They do," Dalton agreed. "They remind me what we are protecting, what we are fighting for. Now let me see to those aches. I worked you hard last night before all this started, and then made you ride all night. Your body must be screaming." Thomas flushed at the reminder of their pre-dawn activities, at how thoroughly Dalton had claimed him before the world intruded. The giant noticed the reaction and smiled darkly. "Later," he promised, "once you are rested and recovered, I will remind you exactly who you belong to. But first, care." He stripped Thomas efficiently, ignoring weak protests about being out in the open. Once the boy stood naked and shivering in the cool air, Dalton guided him into the spring-fed pool. The water was shockingly cold at first, making Thomas gasp, but gradually his muscles began to relax as the chill eased the worst of the aches. Dalton stripped and joined him, his massive frame displacing water as he settled behind Thomas and began working strong fingers into sore muscles. Thomas melted under the attention, small sounds of relief escaping his throat as knots loosened and tension drained away. "We will be all right," Dalton said quietly as he worked. "I have contacts in these territories, men who owe me favors. We will find somewhere safe to settle, somewhere we can build a new life together." "How can you be so certain?" Thomas asked, anxiety creeping back into his voice. Dalton's hands stilled, then turned Thomas to face him. Their eyes met across the small space between them, ice blue boring into uncertain green. "Because I have lived without you, and I have lived with you, and there is no universe in which I choose to go back to before. Whatever it takes, wherever we have to go, we'll make it work." The absolute conviction in his voice steadied Thomas's racing heart. He nodded slowly, letting himself believe in Dalton's certainty, since he could not yet find his own. They made camp in the canyon, Dalton setting up a lean-to shelter, while Thomas tended the horses and prepared what food they had brought. It felt strange to be performing these domestic tasks in the wild, but there was also something liberating about it. No ranch to maintain, no routines to follow, just the two of them against the world. That night, as stars filled the sky above their tiny camp, Dalton pulled Thomas into the shelter and proceeded to make good on his earlier promise. His hands were possessive and demanding, reaffirming his claim with every touch. Thomas surrendered eagerly, desperate for the connection after the terror of almost being separated. "Tell me," Dalton commanded as his body covered Thomas's completely. "Tell me who you belong to." "You," Thomas gasped, already trembling with need. "Only you, Dalton, and will you ever leave me?" "Never," Thomas swore, tears gathering in his eyes from the intensity of emotion. "Never, I promise." "Good boy," Dalton growled, then proceeded to drive Thomas beyond coherent thought with the overwhelming physicality they both craved. Afterward, they lay tangled together under rough blankets, Thomas's tears drying on Dalton's chest. The giant stroked soothing patterns over his back, gentling him down from the overwhelming experience. "I love you," Thomas whispered into the darkness, the first time he had dared speak the words aloud. Dalton's arms tightened around him. "I know," he rumbled. "I have known since the first time you cried for me in the barn, when your tears told me everything your mouth was too afraid to say." "Do you?" Thomas started to ask, then stopped, afraid of the answer. "Love you?" Dalton finished. "Yes, boy, more than I thought possible to love anyone. Why do you think I would burn down my whole life rather than let them take you away?" The confession broke something open in Thomas's chest. Fresh tears spilled over, but these were born of joy rather than sorrow. Dalton caught them with his lips, kissing them away with surprising tenderness for such a dominant man. "Sleep now," he commanded softly. "Tomorrow we ride for Canyon Creek. I know a man there who will help us disappear properly." Thomas obeyed, sinking into exhausted sleep, wrapped in Dalton's protective embrace. His dreams were troubled at first, filled with images of Marshall Webb and accusations of corruption, but gradually they settled into something peaceful. In his dreams, he and Dalton had found a new home, a place where they could love openly, without fear or judgment. The next 3 days passed in a blur of hard riding and rough camping. Dalton pushed them relentlessly, not willing to rest easy until they had put significant distance between themselves and Webb's jurisdiction. Thomas bore the hardship without complaint, drawing strength from Dalton's unwavering certainty that they would survive this. Canyon Creek, when they finally reached it, was barely more than a collection of ramshackle buildings clustered around a general store and saloon. But Dalton seemed to know exactly where he was going, leading them to a small ranch house on the outskirts where an older man was tending horses in the corral. "Dalton Rivers," the man said, his weathered face breaking into a smile. "Never thought I would see you again. Heard you had settled down somewhere east." "Had to unseat myself in a hurry," Dalton replied, dismounting and extending a hand. "This is Thomas. We need help disappearing Marcus." The older man, Marcus, studied Thomas with knowing eyes. "Trouble with the law over him, I would guess. You always did have a weakness for pretty boys who needed protecting." Thomas felt his face heat, but Dalton just laughed. "This one is different, Marcus. This one I am keeping." Marcus nodded slowly. "Well, you came to the right place. Law does not venture out here much, and those of us who live this far from civilization understand the value of not asking questions. You planning to stay local?" "If you can help us find land and get set up," Dalton confirmed. "Somewhere isolated where we can build a new life." "I can do that," Marcus agreed. "Got a piece of property about 10 miles north, up in the hills. Cabin needs work, but it is livable. Previous owner moved on after his partner died, said the memories were too painful. Been sitting empty for 2 years now." Dalton glanced at Thomas, seeking confirmation. Thomas nodded immediately. "Anywhere we can be together sounds perfect." The deal was struck quickly. Marcus accepted Dalton's promise of future payment in the form of labor and livestock once they were established. Within a week, they were moving into the neglected cabin, beginning the hard work of making it habitable. The labor was backbreaking, but Thomas threw himself into it with desperate energy. Repairing the roof, clearing years of accumulated debris, fixing the broken stove. All of it felt like penance for the life Dalton had sacrificed for him. The giant seemed to sense his guilt and addressed it directly one evening as they sat exhausted on the newly repaired porch. "Stop punishing yourself," Dalton commanded quietly. "I made my choice freely." "Thomas, I would make it again 1,000 times over." "You lost so much," Thomas protested. "I gained everything that matters," Dalton countered. He pulled Thomas against his side, wrapping one massive arm around the smaller frame. "That ranch was just wood and land. You are irreplaceable." Thomas buried his face against Dalton's shoulder, tears flowing yet again. The giant had learned to recognize the different kinds of tears Thomas shed. These were release, the letting go of guilt and fear that had been building since their flight began. "That is it," Dalton murmured, holding him close. "Let it out. Your tears always make things better, remember?" Thomas nodded against him, letting himself be held and comforted until the storm passed. When he finally raised his head, Dalton was looking at him with such open affection it made Thomas's breath catch. "Better?" the giant asked. "Yes," Thomas whispered. "Thank you for being patient with me." "Always," Dalton promised. Then his expression shifted, hunger replacing tenderness. "Now I think you need a reminder of why all this struggle is worthwhile." He stood, pulling Thomas to his feet and into the cabin. What followed was intense and demanding, Dalton pushing Thomas with the same relentless energy he brought to all things. But beneath the physical dominance was unmistakable love, evident in every careful touch, every whispered praise, every moment of gentleness mixed with the roughness. When Thomas finally shattered, crying Dalton's name into the darkness, the giant held him through it with fierce possession. "Mine," he growled against Thomas's throat. "My boy, my treasure, mine forever." "Yours," Thomas sobbed in agreement. "Yours completely." As summer turned to autumn, their new life took shape. The cabin transformed under their combined efforts into a comfortable home. They acquired chickens and a small herd of goats, planted a late garden that would give them something to harvest before winter hit. Marcus visited occasionally, bringing supplies and news from the wider world, always careful not to mention anything that might bring trouble to their doorstep. Thomas learned to cook over the temperamental stove, learned to shoot well enough to bring down small game, learned to handle the goats without getting butted. Dalton taught him with surprise and patience, clearly taking pleasure in watching Thomas master new skills. And every night they came together with passion that never seemed to dim. Dalton claiming Thomas with possessive intensity, while Thomas surrendered with increasing confidence. One evening in late October, as the first snow dusted the peaks above their cabin, Thomas stood at the window, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Dalton came up behind him, wrapping massive arms around his waist and resting his chin on top of Thomas's head. "Happy?" the giant asked, echoing that question from so long ago. Thomas leaned back into the solid warmth, thinking about everything they had been through. The fear, the flight, the hardship of starting over, but also the love, the freedom to be openly what they were to each other, the peace of isolation. "Yes," he answered simply, "more than I ever thought possible." "Good," Dalton rumbled, "because I have something to show you." He led Thomas outside to where he had been working on a project in secret. There, carved into a large flat stone near the cabin entrance, were two names, Dalton Rivers and Thomas Garrett, with the date of their arrival at this cabin beneath. "What is this?" Thomas asked, tears already gathering. "Our declaration," Dalton said firmly. "The law may not recognize what we are to each other, but this land knows. This stone will outlast us both, and anyone who finds it will know that we belonged here, that we belong to each other." Thomas traced the carved letters with trembling fingers, overwhelmed by the permanence of the gesture. Dalton came up behind him, wrapping him in a protective embrace. "I know we cannot marry legally," the giant murmured against his hair, "but in every way that matters, you are my partner, my other half. This is as close as we can come to making it official." Thomas turned in his arms, tears streaming freely down his face. I love you, he choked out. I love you so much it terrifies me. Your tears make it better, Dalton reminded him with gentle humor, then sobered. I love you too, Thomas. More than words can express. You are mine and I am yours, and that will never change. They sealed the vow with a kiss as snow began to fall around them, dusting their hair and shoulders with white. When they finally pulled apart, both were crying, Dalton's ice blue eyes suspiciously bright as he cupped Thomas's face in his massive hands. Come inside, he commanded roughly. Let me show you how much you mean to me. What followed was the most intense claiming yet. Dalton worshiping Thomas's body with single-minded devotion while simultaneously demanding complete surrender. Thomas gave it freely, crying and begging and pledging his eternal devotion as waves of overwhelming sensation crashed over him. In the aftermath, they lay tangled together on their bed, both wrung out and trembling. Dalton's hands stroked possessively over Thomas's marked skin, cataloging every sign of ownership with deep satisfaction. Thank you, Thomas whispered into the quiet. For what? Dalton asked. For choosing me, Thomas said. For being willing to lose everything rather than let me go. For building this life with me. Dalton was quiet for a moment, then spoke with absolute conviction. You gave me purpose, Thomas. Before you, I was just existing, going through motions without meaning. You made me feel alive again. Made me want to protect and provide and build. I should be thanking you. Thomas pressed closer, hiding his face against Dalton's broad chest as fresh tears escaped. The giant held him through it, murmuring praise and comfort until the emotional storm passed. As winter settled over their mountain sanctuary, they found a rhythm that felt like home. Days were spent working to ensure they would survive the harsh months ahead, evenings by the fire with Thomas practicing his reading while Dalton carved or did leather work, nights wrapped around each other in the warmth of their shared bed. The first major snowstorm hit in early November, trapping them inside for 3 days. Dalton used the enforced intimacy to push Thomas in new ways, teaching him to surrender even more completely, to trust even more deeply. By the second day, Thomas was a trembling mess, tears flowing constantly, as Dalton kept him in a state of overwhelming sensation for hours at a time. Please, Thomas sobbed, not even sure what he was begging for anymore. His body was hypersensitive, responding to the slightest touch with waves of feeling that left him gasping and shaking. Please what, boy? Dalton demanded, his massive hands never stopping their methodical exploration of Thomas's quivering form. Please stop, or please more. More, Thomas admitted in a broken whisper. Always more. I need you. The confession seemed to ignite something primal in Dalton. He claimed Thomas with renewed intensity, driving the smaller man to heights he had never imagined possible. When Thomas finally shattered completely, screaming his release into the cabin's thick walls, Dalton held him through the aftershocks with fierce tenderness. Perfect, the giant murmured, pressing kisses to Thomas's tear-streaked face. So perfect when you let go completely. Those tears, boy, they destroy me and rebuild me all at once. Thomas could only whimper in response, utterly wrung out and floating in the strange peaceful space that came after total surrender. Dalton bathed him with warm water heated on the stove, his huge hands impossibly gentle as they soothed over sensitized skin. Then he bundled Thomas in blankets and held him by the fire, feeding him soup and bread with patient care. I love you, Thomas murmured drowsily, safe and warm and completely satisfied. I know, Dalton rumbled. Your body tells me every time you surrender. Your tears tell me every time you cry for me. Your heart tells me in every moment we share. When the storm finally broke and they could emerge from the cabin, they found the world transformed into a pristine white wonderland. Thomas stood on the porch, breathing in the crisp cold air, feeling fundamentally changed by the intensity of what they had shared during those isolated days. Dalton came up behind him, wrapping a heavy coat around Thomas's shoulders. What are you thinking? He asked. That I used to be afraid of storms, Thomas admitted. Afraid of being trapped, of being vulnerable. But with you, being trapped just means more time together. Being vulnerable means being seen and loved anyway. The giant's arms tightened around him. You are never trapped with me, Thomas. You are free to leave any time you choose. You stay because you want to, not because you have to. I stay because leaving would kill me, Thomas corrected softly. You are not my cage, Dalton. You are my home. The words clearly moved the giant. He turned Thomas in his arms and kissed him deeply, pouring years of loneliness and newfound joy into the connection. When they finally broke apart, both had tears freezing on their cheeks. Come inside before we freeze, Dalton commanded roughly, emotion making his voice harsh. I need you warm and alive. They spent the rest of that day making love by the fire, slower and gentler than the previous day's intensity, but no less meaningful. Dalton mapped every inch of Thomas's body as if memorizing it, and Thomas accepted the attention with quiet tears of gratitude and love. As evening fell, they lay tangled together on a nest of blankets before the hearth. Dalton's fingers traced idle patterns on Thomas's bare back, and Thomas drifted in that peaceful space between sleep and waking. Tell me about before, Thomas murmured. Before you settled at the ranch. Before you became the man who found me in the barn. Dalton was quiet for so long, Thomas thought he would not answer. Then the giant began to speak, his deep voice soft with memory. I was a different person then, he said. Angry at the world, angry at myself. I had loved a man during the war, my commanding officer. We kept it secret, of course, but it was real and true and the only bright thing in all that darkness. He died at Antietam. Took a bullet meant for me. I held him while he bled out, watched the life fade from his eyes. And something in me died too. Thomas pressed closer, offering wordless comfort. Dalton's hand tightened on his hip. After the war, I drifted. Took work where I could find it, never staying long anywhere. Got into fights, drank too much, did not care if I lived or died. Then one day, I woke up in a jail cell after a particularly bad brawl and realized I was wasting the life my lover had died to save. So I found that land, built that ranch, tried to make something of myself. But you were still alone, Thomas observed. I was, Dalton agreed. I told myself I preferred it. That isolation was safer than risking my heart again. Then you stumbled into my barn, all wide eyes and innocence and desperate need, and I knew I was done running from connection. Did you know right away? Thomas asked. That first night, did you know I would change everything? Dalton huffed a quiet laugh. I knew you were dangerous the moment you looked at me with those green eyes. I knew I was lost when your first tears fell, and I wanted nothing more than to comfort you. And I knew it was over for my solitude when I touched you and felt like I was finally coming home after years of wandering. Thomas shifted to look up at Dalton's face, reading the truth in those ice-blue eyes. I was so scared that first night, he confessed. Scared of you, scared of what I was feeling, scared of wanting something I did not understand. I know, Dalton said gently. That is why I pushed you the way I did. You needed to be overwhelmed, needed your mind to shut down so your body could show you what you truly wanted. It worked, Thomas admitted with a watery smile. By the time morning came, I could not imagine being anywhere else. They fell silent again, watching firelight dance on the cabin walls. Outside, wind howled through the peaks, but inside they were warm and safe and together. Dalton, Thomas said after a while. Yes, boy, promise me something, anything. Promise me that no matter what happens, no matter who tries to separate us or what obstacles we face, you will never give up on us. On this, Dalton rolled them over so he could look directly into Thomas's eyes. I promise, he said with absolute conviction. There is no force on earth strong enough to make me let you go willingly. They would have to kill me first, and even then, I would haunt you from beyond the grave. The dramatic declaration made Thomas laugh, even as tears spilled over. You are ridiculous, he said fondly. I am serious, Dalton corrected, but his lips curved in a small smile. You are mine, Thomas Garrett. Mine in this life and whatever comes after. That is not a claim I make lightly, or one I will ever surrender. Good, Thomas whispered, because I am not going anywhere. They made love again then, soft and slow and achingly tender. And when Thomas cried from the overwhelming emotion of it all, Dalton caught each tear and whispered that they made everything better, that Thomas's tears were precious gifts that showed the depth of his feeling. Later, As Thomas drifted toward sleep, wrapped in Dalton's protective embrace, he thought about how far he had come from that terrified boy in the barn. He had found strength he never knew he possessed, discovered depths to his own desires that still sometimes surprised him, built a life that defied everything society said was proper or acceptable, and he had never been happier. Marcus visited once more before the snows made travel impossible, bringing news that made both men tense. Marshal Webb had indeed returned to Dalton's old ranch with reinforcements, only to find it abandoned. He had wasted weeks searching the immediate territories before finally giving up and returning to his own jurisdiction. "He swore he would find you eventually," Marcus reported. "Said crimes like yours should not go unpunished. But my sense is he has bigger problems to deal with now. Apache raiders have been hitting settlements in his territory. He cannot spare resources to chase shadows into the Badlands." "Still," Dalton said quietly, "we will need to be careful. No trips to bigger towns, no drawing attention." Marcus nodded. "I will bring supplies when I can. No need for you to risk exposure." And he looked at Thomas with surprising kindness. "You take care of this big fool boy. Men like him do not come along often." "I will," Thomas promised solemnly. After Marcus left, they settled in for the long winter. The isolation should have been oppressive, but instead, it felt like freedom. No one to judge, no one to condemn. Just two men building a life together in defiance of a world that said they should not exist. Spring arrived eventually, bringing with it the gradual thaw and return of life to the land. They planted a larger garden, added to their livestock, made improvements to the cabin. Thomas had filled out over the winter, no longer the slight waif who had stumbled into Dalton's barn, but a capable young man who could handle the demands of frontier life. But some things never changed. Dalton's possessive need to claim and own, Thomas's deep craving to surrender and submit. The tears that fell so easily when emotion overwhelmed, the giant's insistence that those tears made everything better. On the anniversary of their arrival at the mountain cabin, they stood together before the carved stone, reading the declaration Dalton had made. Thomas traced the letters with his fingers, thinking about everything they had survived to get here. "Any regrets?" Dalton asked quietly. Thomas turned to face him, taking in the massive frame, the ice blue eyes, the face he had come to love more than his own life. "Not a single one," he answered truthfully. "This is exactly where I am meant to be." "With me," Dalton clarified. "With you," Thomas agreed. "Always with you." They made love that night with particular intensity, reaffirming vows spoken and unspoken. And when Thomas cried from the overwhelming force of his emotions, Dalton caught every tear and whispered the truth they both knew. "Your tears make it better, my beautiful boy. They always will." Years passed. The world beyond their mountain changed. Laws shifted, but Dalton and Thomas remained constant. They built a life that defied easy categorization, equal parts gentle domesticity and intense passion, quiet partnership and obvious dominance. Visitors were rare, but those who came learned quickly not to question the nature of the relationship they witnessed. On Thomas's 30th birthday, Dalton gave him a gift that made him weep openly, a leather-bound journal, blank pages waiting to be filled. "For our story," the giant explained. "So when we are gone, someone will know that we existed, that we loved, that we refused to let the world tell us how to live." Thomas pressed the journal to his chest, tears streaming down his face. Dalton pulled him close, holding him while he cried, whispering the words that had become their private liturgy. "Your tears make it better. They show me your heart, your truth, your love. Never stop crying for me, Thomas." "I will not," Thomas promised. "As long as I have you, the tears will flow." "Never, because you will always have me," Dalton corrected firmly. "Forever, until the day I die and beyond, if there is anything after." The promise was kept. They lived and loved and built a legacy in their isolated mountain sanctuary. And when old age finally claimed them, decades later, they went together as they had lived, wrapped in each other's arms, Thomas crying gentle tears, while Dalton whispered that those tears made everything better, had always made everything better, and would echo in whatever came next. The stone declaration remained long after they were gone, weathered but still legible, testament to two men who had refused to let judgment separate them, who had chosen love over safety, freedom over conformity. And sometimes, travelers passing through would find the stone and wonder about the story behind those carved names, about the love that had been fierce enough to carve itself into permanence, about the tears and passion that had made a remote cabin into a home. The end.